Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. I spent most summers crawling through attics and fixing air conditioners. The attics felt like ovens. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most months that was enough. I lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in Colorado Springs. The carpet was stained. The air conditioner barely worked. The guy upstairs sounded like he dropped bowling balls on the floor every night. Still, it was home. My best friend Tyler worked for the same HVAC company. We had known each other since high school. Tyler could talk to anyone. I couldn't. Somehow, we became friends. 10 years later, we were still riding around together in the same company van, fixing broken units, arguing about sports, complaining about customers, the usual stuff. One Thursday afternoon, we stopped at a gas station between service calls. We bought 2 burritos that had probably been sitting under a heat lamp all day. The temperature was close to 95 degrees. My shirt was soaked with sweat. We sat on the back of the truck and ate lunch. Cars passed by on the road. Tyler looked over at me. "You ever think about doing something else?" I laughed. "Like what?" "I don't know. Anything besides spending your life inside attics." I shrugged. Honestly, I was focused on getting through the month. The company had cut overtime earlier that year. My truck needed new brakes. My younger sister had just started community college. I helped her whenever I could. Life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't getting better either. Tyler pointed toward the mountains in the distance. "Feels like we're going to be doing this forever. Could be worse." He laughed. "That's your problem. Your standards are too low." I laughed too. At the time, it felt like another normal afternoon. Just 2 friends eating bad gas station food, talking about nothing important. A week later, Tyler and I would be driving deep into the Rocky Mountains. Neither of us knew it yet. The first sign that something was changing came the following Tuesday. Tyler called me during lunch and told me he had found a temporary job listing online. It wasn't HV work. It wasn't construction either. It was listed as seasonal property maintenance. The pay was almost double what we normally made. The catch was that it was located deep in the Rocky Mountains. "Sounds sketchy," I told him. "Everything sounds sketchy to you, because most things are." Tyler laughed. "Come on, it's 6 weeks. We babysit a cabin, do basic maintenance, keep an eye on the property, and leave with enough money to stop eating gas station burritos." I told him I'd think about it. The truth was I already was. A few days earlier, my mechanic had handed me an estimate for the truck repairs. I had stared at the number for a solid minute before asking him if he was sure he hadn't accidentally added an extra digit. He hadn't. My savings account wasn't exactly impressive. The overtime cuts had hurt more than I wanted to admit. By Thursday evening, Tyler had convinced me to attend an interview. The interview itself took less than 20 minutes. The property manager was a man in his late 50s named Carl. He looked more like a retired hunting guide than someone who managed vacation properties. He asked about our work history, asked if we were comfortable being isolated for long periods of time, asked if we knew basic repairs. Then he offered us the job. Just like that. No second interview. No background check that I knew about. No complicated paperwork. The whole thing felt oddly easy. Still, the money was real. We signed the contracts that afternoon. A week later, we loaded supplies into my truck and started heading west. The drive took most of the day. Colorado Springs slowly disappeared behind us. The highways became smaller. Towns became farther apart. Cell service came and went. By late afternoon, the mountains seemed to rise endlessly around us. Tyler spent most of the drive messing with the radio and complaining about my music choices. Nobody voluntarily listens to this. Plenty of people do. Name one. Me. That doesn't count. We stopped twice for gas and once for coffee. Everything felt normal. Honestly, it felt more like the beginning of a camping trip than a job. Around sunset, we reached a small mountain town that barely deserved the name. 1 gas station, 1 diner, 1 general store. Carl was waiting for us outside the diner. He waved us over and bought us dinner. The place smelled like bacon grease and old wood. Locals sat quietly in booths watching a baseball game on television. Carl spent most of the meal explaining our responsibilities. Check generators, Inspect fences. Monitor weather damage. Report any issues. The property itself sat several miles beyond the town limits. There were no neighboring cabins nearby, no tourists, no hiking trails, just forest. You'll like the quiet, Carl said. Tyler grinned. I've never met quiet I didn't like. Carl smiled, but something about the expression looked forced. At the time, I figured he was just tired. After dinner, we followed his truck up a winding mountain road. The sun had almost disappeared behind the peaks. Pine trees lined both sides of the road. Shadows stretched across the asphalt. 20 minutes later, we turned onto a gravel path. Another 15 minutes after that, the cabin finally appeared. It was larger than I expected. 2 stories. Dark wood siding, metal roof, wide front porch. A detached storage shed sat nearby. A small creek ran through the trees behind the property. The entire place looked like something from a vacation brochure. Tyler stepped out of the truck and whistled. Okay, this is definitely better than attics. I had to admit he had a point. The air smelled clean. The temperature had dropped enough to feel comfortable. Mountains surrounded us in every direction. For a few minutes, I actually felt lucky. Carl helped us unload supplies. Then he handed over a ring of keys. Generators are already fueled. Food stocked. Emergency numbers are on the fridge. Anything else we should know? Tyler asked. Carl hesitated, just for a second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Actually, yes. He handed it to me. The paper looked old, not ancient, just heavily used, folded and unfolded too many times. I glanced down. There were 7 numbered entries on the page. What is this? I asked. Carl rubbed the back of his neck. House rules. Tyler laughed immediately. House rules. Just read them. You're serious? Very. The smile had completely disappeared from Carl's face. Tyler looked at me. I looked back at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Carl wasn't joking. That much was obvious. Finally, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. We'll read them later. Carl nodded. Read them tonight. The way he said it made me pay attention. Not because it sounded scary, more because it sounded exhausted. Like he had repeated the same sentence dozens of times before. We finished unloading shortly afterward. Carl got back into his truck. Before closing the door, he glanced toward the tree line behind the cabin. Then back at us. Just read the paper. That was the last thing he said before driving away. Tyler watched the taillights disappear down the gravel road. Then he shook his head. Every mountain job comes with a weird old guy. I think it's required by law. I laughed. Maybe. We carried the last boxes inside. The cabin looked surprisingly comfortable. Full kitchen, wood stove, satellite television, bunk room upstairs, clean furniture. Somebody had clearly maintained the place. Tyler immediately claimed the bed closest to the window. We unpacked, ate leftover diner food, watched television for an hour. Everything felt ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary. Around 10 o'clock, I remembered the folded paper sitting in my pocket. Tyler was flipping channels when I pulled it out and set it on the coffee table. Guess we should read this. Tyler grabbed it first. His grin lasted about 5 seconds. Then it slowly disappeared as he started reading. Tyler finished reading the page and slowly lowered it onto the coffee table. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then he laughed. Not because he thought it was funny, more because he didn't seem to know what else to do. Okay, he said. That's definitely weird. I took the paper from him and started reading it myself. The first rule seemed strange. The second one was stranger. By the time I reached the 7th rule, I found myself reading certain lines twice. Not because they were complicated, because they sounded oddly specific. The kind of instructions somebody writes after something has already happened. I looked up at Tyler. What do you think? I think Carl spends too much time alone. Yeah, maybe the last caretaker had a sense of humor. I nodded. That seemed reasonable enough. Honestly, it was the explanation I wanted. We had just driven several hours into the mountains. The cabin was comfortable. The paycheck was excellent. I wasn't interested in turning the place into some kind of ghost story during the first night. Tyler tossed the paper back onto the table. Well, I'm not planning to get kidnapped by forest goblins tonight. Good plan. I'm serious. We should write our own list. No. Rule 1. Tyler always gets the bigger bedroom. There are literally 2 beds in the same room. Exactly. I get the better one. We spent another hour watching television and making fun of the rules. Looking back, I think both of us were trying to convince ourselves they didn't matter. Around midnight, we finally headed upstairs. The mountain air had cooled considerably. Wind brushed against the cabin walls. Pine branches occasionally scraped the roof. The sounds felt normal, familiar, the kind of noises you expect when you're sleeping in the woods. I fell asleep faster than expected. The drive had worn me out. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight was already pushing through the curtains. Tyler was still asleep. His blanket had somehow ended up on the floor. That wasn't unusual. Tyler moved constantly when he slept. I got dressed and headed downstairs. The kitchen window overlooked the backside of the property. The creek Carl had mentioned wound through the trees beyond the cabin. Morning fog lingered above the water. Everything looked peaceful. The first few days passed exactly how you would expect. We inspected fences, checked generators, cleared fallen branches from a trail leading to an equipment shed. Most of the work was simple maintenance. Occasionally, Carl radioed us with minor tasks. Otherwise, we were alone. The isolation took some getting used to. No traffic, no neighbors, no city noise, just wind, birds, and the occasional distant sound of moving water. Tyler adapted immediately. This is the best job I've ever had. We've been here 3 days. Exactly. Every evening we cooked dinner, watched television, and talked about completely pointless things. Football predictions, movies, whether cereal counted as soup. Tyler was convinced it did. By the 4th day, I started feeling more comfortable. The rules had already begun fading into the background. We still joked about them occasionally, mostly because nothing unusual had happened. Then something small changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously wrong, just a detail. We were repairing part of a damaged fence line roughly half a mile from the cabin when Tyler stopped hammering and looked toward the trees. You hear that? I listened. Wind, birds, water somewhere in the distance. Hear what? Thought somebody yelled. I shook my head. Probably another hiker. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. The thing was, we hadn't seen another person since arriving. Not one. Still, mountains carried sound strangely. We went back to work. 20 minutes later, Tyler mentioned it again. There it is. I stopped. I didn't hear anything. He stared into the trees for several seconds before finally shrugging. Never mind. We finished repairs and returned to the cabin before dinner. Neither of us brought it up again. The next morning, I found fresh footprints near the storage shed. They looked like boot prints, deep enough to be recent. I assumed they belonged to Carl. That explanation made perfect sense. Except Carl hadn't visited the property for 2 days. I mentioned it anyway. Tyler walked over and looked down. Maybe from the last guy, after 2 days. Maybe. He sounded less certain than before. Still, neither of us thought much about it. The mountains were full of simple explanations. People passed through. Hunters wandered around. Maintenance crews showed up unexpectedly. It wasn't a big deal. That afternoon, we finally explored farther down the creek behind the cabin. The water moved east through a narrow channel lined with rocks and fallen trees. We spent nearly an hour walking beside it. Tyler skipped stones across the water while talking about buying a motorcycle he absolutely could not afford. Eventually, we turned around and headed back. Before leaving, Tyler pointed downstream. At least we'll remember this place. Why? Because if somebody asked me which direction this creek flows, I'd actually know. I laughed, still thinking about the rules. They're hard to forget. The comment stayed with me longer than I expected. That night, clouds rolled across the mountains shortly after sunset. Rain tapped softly against the roof. We stayed inside playing cards while the weather moved through. Around 10:30, the power flickered once, then returned. A few minutes later, it flickered again. Tyler glanced toward the ceiling. Generator should kick in if we lose it. Probably just weather. Another flicker. Then everything stabilized. Outside, rain continued falling steadily. The atmosphere inside the cabin felt oddly comfortable. Warm lights, coffee brewing in the kitchen, wind pushing against the windows. For a while, I forgot entirely about the paper sitting in a drawer downstairs. Then, just before midnight, a sharp sound echoed somewhere outside. Tyler looked up. You hear that? This time I had. It sounded like wood striking wood. Maybe a branch hitting part of the porch. We waited. Nothing followed. Probably the storm, I said. Tyler nodded. Neither of us moved. Another sound came a minute later, slightly louder this time, then silence again. I stood and walked toward the front window. Rain streaked across the glass. Darkness swallowed everything beyond the porch light. Nothing seemed unusual. I returned to the couch. See anything? No. Tyler settled back into his chair. For a while, neither of us spoke. Wind rattled branches outside. Rain continued falling. Somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin, the forest stretched for miles in every direction, hidden by darkness, waiting quietly. Neither of us knew it then, but the first real test of those rules was already getting closer. The storm stayed over the mountains for most of the night. Rain hammered the roof in waves. Sometimes it softened into a steady patter. Other times it sounded like somebody was dumping buckets of water onto the cabin. Around 12:30, Tyler finally gave up on television and headed upstairs. I stayed behind for another 20 minutes, mostly because I wasn't tired yet. The weather had a strange effect on me. I liked listening to storms. They made the world feel smaller, safer, somehow. Eventually, I turned off the television and started toward the stairs. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front door. I stopped immediately. For a second, I just stood there listening. Rain continued hitting the roof. Wind rattled the windows. Nothing else followed. I looked at the clock above the kitchen. 12:47 amperes. My first thought was that a branch had struck the porch. My second thought was the sheet of paper sitting inside the kitchen drawer. I stood there for another few seconds before shaking my head. Coincidences happen. The human brain liked finding patterns where none existed. I started toward the stairs again. Then the knocks came a second time. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3. Evenly spaced. Loud enough that there was no mistaking where they came from. The front door. I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Not fear exactly. More uncertainty. The cabin sat miles from town. Nobody should have been out there in the middle of a storm. Still, accidents happened. A stranded hiker. A hunter. Somebody with vehicle trouble. I stepped toward the living room window. Then stopped. The rule surfaced in my memory immediately. If you hear 3 knocks on the door after midnight, do not open it. The person outside will usually call one of your names. I remember rolling my eyes at myself. I was a grown man standing in a perfectly normal cabin. Yet somehow I was letting a ridiculous piece of paper influence my decision. Before I could think any further, a voice drifted through the storm. Tyler. The sound froze me in place. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The voice sounded close, just beyond the door. Tyler. I stared toward the entrance. Every hair on my arms suddenly stood up. There was something deeply unsettling about hearing my friend's name spoken by somebody standing outside a cabin in the middle of nowhere after midnight. I listened carefully. The voice sounded male, calm, almost casual. Another knock followed, 3 more strikes. Then silence. I considered waking Tyler. Instead, I walked upstairs. He was asleep immediately, which wasn't unusual. Tyler could sleep through almost anything. I nudged his shoulder. Tyler. He groaned. What? Somebody's outside. His eyes opened halfway. What time is it? Most 1. He sat up slowly. You're kidding. No. Carl. Maybe? Tyler rubbed his face and climbed out of bed. We headed downstairs together. The cabin felt different now. Not dangerous exactly. Just tense. We stood in the living room listening. Nothing. No voice. No knocking. Only rain. Tyler looked toward the door. Probably somebody with car trouble. Maybe? Let's check. The paper said not to. Tyler stared at me, then laughed softly. You actually care about that thing? No. Sounds like you do. Before I could answer, another voice floated through the storm. This time it said my name. My stomach dropped immediately. The voice sounded familiar. Not because I recognized the speaker, because it sounded strangely similar to somebody I knew. Not identical, just close enough to bother me. Tyler stopped smiling. The voice came again. Calm, patient, calling my name from the darkness beyond the door. We stood there for several seconds. Neither of us moved. Finally, Tyler walked toward the window beside the door and peeked through the blinds. I don't see anyone. How? Rain's too heavy. Another pause followed. Then the voice stopped entirely. No footsteps. No movement. Nothing. Eventually, Tyler shook his head. Whoever it was probably left, without saying anything. People are weird, I wanted to argue. Instead, I let it go. We locked the door again and headed upstairs. Sleep came slowly after that. Every small sound seemed louder than before. Wind, rain, branches, the cabin settling. I kept expecting another knock. None came. Morning arrived gray and wet. Tyler immediately treated the entire thing like a joke. Congratulations. We survived night one. Very funny. Maybe Carl hires actors. At 1 a.m, he's committed to the bit. Despite his confidence, I noticed him glance toward the front porch several times during breakfast. Eventually, we stepped outside to inspect the property. Rain had stopped shortly before sunrise. Everything smelled damp and fresh. Water dripped from pine branches overhead. Mud covered most of the ground around the cabin. Tyler was the first to notice the footprints. Hey, I walked over. A trail of muddy prints led across the porch. They stopped directly in front of the door. My eyes followed them backward. The tracks came from the yard, straight out of the forest. Tyler crouched beside one of the prints. That's not great. Maybe from yesterday. These were made after the rain. He was right. The edges looked fresh, sharp, recent. I counted roughly a dozen prints. Then they simply ended at the porch. There were no tracks leading away. Tyler noticed that too. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Finally, he stood up. Okay, that's weird. I stared at the final print nearest the door. It looked perfectly ordinary. A boot print. Nothing supernatural about it. Yet the absence of a return trail bothered me more than I wanted to admit. We spent most of the day working anyway. Routine helped. Fences still needed repairs. Equipment still needed inspection. The normal tasks pushed the previous night into the background, at least until late afternoon. We were checking a generator behind the storage shed when I heard somebody call my name. I turned immediately. Nobody stood there, just trees. Tyler looked over. What? Thought I heard something. He frowned. From where? I pointed toward the woods. Tyler's expression changed slightly. I heard it too. Cold feeling settled in my stomach. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then the forest became silent. Completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Tyler slowly stood up. Let's head back. For once, I didn't argue. We headed back to the cabin earlier than usual that evening. Neither of us said much during the walk. Every few minutes I caught myself looking over my shoulder. Not because I thought I would see someone, because part of me expected to. The silence in the forest had lingered long enough to leave an impression. Once we got back, the normal sound slowly returned. Wind moved through the trees. Birds called somewhere beyond the creek. The world felt normal again, or at least close enough. Tyler tried to laugh it off while making dinner. Maybe we've been watching too many horror movies. Maybe. First the weird rules, then the mystery footprints. Now we're getting scared by birds. I wasn't scared. Sure. He pointed a wooden spoon at me. You looked terrified. I rolled my eyes and grabbed 2 plates from a cabinet. The conversation drifted toward football after that. Then movies. Then random stories from high school. For a while, things felt almost ordinary again. The kind of ordinary that makes you question whether the strange moments even happened. Around sunset, the clouds finally cleared. The mountains glowed orange through the windows. Shadows stretched across the forest. Night settled quickly afterward. By 9 o'clock, the darkness outside looked almost solid. The cabin felt smaller after dark. Not physically smaller, just isolated. During daylight, you could see the mountains and trees. At night, the windows became black mirrors. They reflected more of the cabin than the world outside. Around 10:30, we lost satellite television. The screen froze and eventually displayed an error message. Tyler tossed the remote onto the couch. Great. Weather probably messed something up. Now what? Cards? He groaned dramatically. I'd rather stare at a wall. We ended up playing cards anyway. By 11:30, I had almost forgotten about the strange voice from the previous night. Then something landed on the roof. The sound echoed through the entire cabin. A heavy thump followed by a scrape. Tyler looked up immediately. What was that? Branch, maybe. Another scrape moved slowly across the metal roof. Then silence. I remembered Rule 4 before I even realized I was thinking about it. If you hear footsteps on the roof, start counting. Ignore them if they stop before 20 steps. Tyler was already grinning. Please tell me you're thinking about the list. I sighed. Unfortunately, a few seconds passed. Then we heard it. Step, step, step. Something was walking across the roof. Not sliding, not scraping. Walking. Tyler slowly lowered his cards. Okay, that's a little weird. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. One after another, we both listened. 4, 5, 6. The rhythm remained steady. The sound moved from one side of the roof toward the other. 7, 8, 9. Tyler looked toward me. Neither of us spoke. 10, 11, 12. My stomach tightened. The footsteps sounded too measured, too controlled. Animals usually moved differently, faster, less predictable. 13, 14, 15. The sound reached the center of the roof. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Both of us froze. The footsteps continued. 21, 22, 23. I slowly set my cards down. Tyler wasn't smiling anymore. 24, 25. Then silence. Complete silence. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Finally, Tyler spoke. That was definitely more than 20. I nodded. My eyes drifted toward the light switch. The rule surfaced in my head again. Turn off every light in the cabin and remain completely silent. It is trying to determine how many people are inside. The sentence sounded ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. Yet neither of us laughed. Another footstep crossed the roof. Then another. Tyler stood up first. Without saying a word, he walked to the nearest switch and turned it off. The living room darkened immediately. I found myself doing the same thing. One by one, the lights disappeared. Kitchen, hallway, dining area. Within seconds, the cabin sat in darkness except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. Neither of us discussed why we were doing it. We simply did it. Then we sat, waiting, listening. The footsteps resumed. Slow, patient, crossing the roof again. Back and forth. Sometimes stopping completely, then starting again. At one point, they seemed directly above us. The sound remained there for nearly a minute. Neither Tyler nor I said a word. My breathing sounded unusually loud. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, then disappeared entirely. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, Tyler whispered, "Still there? I don't think so." Another long pause. "You know what's bothering me?" "What?" Whatever was on the roof never sounded heavy enough. I knew exactly what he meant. A bear should have sounded heavier, much heavier. Yet the footsteps had almost sounded human. That realization made neither of us comfortable. Around 1 in the morning, we finally turned the lights back on. We checked every window, every door. Nothing seemed out of place. No movement outside. No sign that anything had happened. We eventually went upstairs, though sleep came slowly. I woke sometime later to the feeling that something was wrong. At first, I couldn't identify what had disturbed me. Then I noticed the room felt brighter than before. Not daylight, artificial light. I sat up. Tyler was already awake. He was staring toward the window. "You see that?" His voice sounded strained. I followed his gaze. Through a gap in the curtains, a faint glow shone somewhere in the distance, deep within the forest. My mind immediately jumped to the old fire lookout tower Carl had mentioned. The abandoned one. The tower with no electricity. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The light remained visible between the trees. Steady, unmoving. Tyler slowly stood. Maybe somebody's up there. At 3 in the morning. I don't know. We continued staring. Eventually, the light disappeared behind shifting fog. Then it returned. Then vanished again. I suddenly remembered another rule. If you see a light at the top of the tower at night, close the curtains and avoid looking in that direction again. For the first time since arriving, I felt genuine fear. Not panic, not terror. Just the quiet realization that too many strange things were starting to match the paper. Tyler finally stepped away from the window. Neither of us said it out loud. We both knew what we were thinking. The rules were no longer funny. And somewhere beyond the forest, hidden among the mountains, a light was shining from a place that should have been dark. Neither of us slept much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about the light. It wasn't just the fact that it existed. It was where it existed. Carl had specifically mentioned that tower during dinner. At the time, I assumed it was local folklore. Every remote area seemed to have some story attached to it. An abandoned mine, a haunted road, a missing hunter. Something people repeated because there wasn't much else to talk about. But now I wasn't so sure. By the time dawn arrived, both Tyler and I looked exhausted. We made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in near silence. The folded paper rested between us. Neither of us wanted to admit it, but we had both started taking it seriously. Tyler finally broke the silence. "You think Carl knows what's going on?" "Probably." "Then why didn't he explain any of it?" "Maybe he tried." Tyler looked toward the window. The forest seemed harmless again in daylight. Bright sunlight reflected off the creek. Birds moved between the trees. The mountains looked almost beautiful. It was amazing how quickly daylight could erase fear. Almost. "We should talk to him." I nodded. Around noon, we radioed Carl and asked if he could stop by the property. His response came several minutes later through static. He said he'd arrive before evening. The rest of the day felt unusually slow. Neither of us wandered far from the cabin. We completed a few maintenance tasks nearby and spent most of the afternoon waiting. Carl finally arrived shortly before sunset. The moment he stepped out of his truck, Tyler walked directly toward him. "We need to talk about the rules." Carl didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked tired. We sat together on the front porch while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Tyler described the knocking, the footprints, the footsteps on the roof, the light in the tower. Carl listened without interrupting. When Tyler finished, Carl stared into the forest for several seconds. "How many steps?" "What?" "On the roof." Tyler exchanged a glance with me. "More than 20. Carl nodded slowly. He didn't seem shocked. He didn't even seem curious. It felt like he had expected that answer. "You turned off the lights?" "Yeah." "Good." Tyler leaned forward. "Can you tell us what the hell is happening?" Carl rubbed his hands together. For a long moment, I thought he might finally explain everything. Instead, he sighed. "I can tell you what I've seen." Neither of us spoke. Carl continued. "I've managed this property for 14 years. The rules were already here when I arrived. The caretaker before me followed them. The caretaker before him followed them too." "Why?" Carl looked directly at Tyler. "Because the ones who didn't had a habit of disappearing." Silence settled across the porch. Somewhere beyond the trees, water moved through the creek. "Disappearing how?" Carl shrugged. "Gone." Tyler shook his head. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." I studied Carl carefully. He wasn't acting like somebody telling a campfire story. There was no excitement in his voice, no drama, just exhaustion. "You ever see the man in the woods?" Carl nodded once, 3 times. A chill moved through me. "What happened?" "Nothing. I stayed inside." Tyler laughed nervously. "You're serious?" Carl looked at him. Tyler stopped laughing immediately. Before leaving, Carl repeated something that stayed with me long after he drove away. "The rules aren't there to protect you from understanding what's out there. They're there to keep whatever's out there from noticing you." Then he left. Darkness arrived quickly after that. Neither Tyler nor I spoke much during dinner. The conversation with Carl had changed something. Until then, there had always been room for doubt. Practical explanations, coincidences, misunderstandings. But Carl believed the rules. Not because he was crazy, because he seemed genuinely afraid not to. Around 9 o'clock, Tyler suggested checking the old tower the next day. "Maybe we'll find somebody using it." Carl said stay away. Carl says a lot of things. I wasn't convinced. Still, part of me wanted answers too. We eventually agreed to decide in the morning. Around 11:30, we headed upstairs. For the first time since arriving, I locked the bedroom door behind us. It felt ridiculous. Yet neither of us commented on it. I fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next thing I remember was waking suddenly. Complete darkness filled the room. For several seconds, I couldn't understand what had disturbed me. Then I noticed the silence. Not ordinary silence. Total silence, no wind, no insects, No creak. Nothing. Beside me, Tyler shifted in bed. You awake? Yeah. Something's wrong. Before I could answer, the porch light went out. We both saw it happen through the curtains. 1 second, the faint glow illuminated part of the room. The next second, it vanished completely. My eyes immediately moved toward the clock beside the bed. 2:17 amperes. Neither of us spoke. Rule 6 surfaced instantly in my mind. If the porch light suddenly goes out, check the time. If it is after midnight, do not step outside under any circumstances. Tyler sat upright. Probably the bulb. Maybe. Neither of us sounded convinced. Then we heard it. A scream. Distant at first, then louder. A man's voice. Somewhere outside. Calling for help. The sound echoed through the trees. Raw panic filled every word. My heart started pounding immediately. Tyler was already climbing out of bed. Somebody's hurt. Wait. Another scream cut through the darkness. Closer this time. Followed by crashing branches. It sounded as though somebody was running through the forest toward the cabin. Tyler moved toward the door. I grabbed his arm. The rule. Somebody needs help. Another scream. Then another. The sound felt horribly real. Not theatrical. Not exaggerated. Genuine terror. Every instinct in my body told me to help. That was what made it so difficult. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The screaming continued outside, then suddenly stopped. Just like that. Silence returned. Tyler slowly released the doorknob. We stood there listening. Nothing followed. No footsteps. No voice. Movement. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Eventually, the forest sounds returned. Wind moved through the trees again. The creek flowed somewhere below the cabin. Everything sounded normal. Yet neither of us slept for the rest of the night. Deep down, I think we both knew the same thing. Whatever had been outside wanted us to open that door, and for a few seconds, it had come dangerously close to succeeding. Morning arrived beneath a layer of gray clouds. Neither of us had managed more than an hour or two of sleep. I felt exhausted before the day even started. Tyler looked worse. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and he barely touched his breakfast. For a while, we sat in silence listening to coffee drip into the pot. Eventually, Tyler leaned back in his chair and stared toward the window. I'm done waiting. I knew what he meant immediately. The tower. The light. The questions neither Carl nor the rules had answered. It's a bad idea. Probably. Then why do it? Tyler shrugged. Because every day we stay here, things get weirder. I couldn't argue with that. By noon, we had packed water, flashlights, radios, and a small first aid kit. Before leaving, I folded the sheet of rules and shoved it into my jacket pocket. I didn't know why. Habit, maybe. The forest looked completely different during daylight. Sunlight filtered through the pines. Birds moved between branches. The creek reflected patches of sky through the trees. It felt impossible to believe that the same woods could produce the fear we experienced every night. We followed the creek north because Carl had mentioned the tower sat somewhere beyond it. The hike took longer than expected. Fallen trees blocked parts of the terrain. Steep slopes forced us to circle around certain areas. For nearly 2 hours, nothing unusual happened. We talked about work, about football, about whether we should quit after the season ended. The normal conversation helped. Then Tyler stopped walking. I nearly walked into him. What? He pointed ahead. Something stood between the trees roughly 50 yards away. At first I thought it was a person. Then I realized it was only a dead pine trunk. We both laughed nervously. The fact that we had mistaken a tree for a person bothered me more than I wanted to admit. We continued deeper into the forest. Around mid-afternoon, we finally found the tower. It stood atop a rocky rise overlooking miles of wilderness. The structure looked ancient. Weathered wood, rusted supports, broken windows near the top. The entire thing leaned slightly to one side. Even from a distance, it looked abandoned. No power lines, Tyler said quietly. He was right. We spent several minutes walking around the base. Nobody had been there recently. No vehicles. No equipment. No signs of maintenance. Yet when we climbed partway up the stairs, I found something unexpected. Fresh boot prints. The wood was coated in dust and pine debris. The prints cut directly through it. Recent. Maybe a day old, maybe less. Tyler crouched beside them. Tell me you see this. I nodded. Neither of us felt like climbing farther. The strange confidence that had brought us there had faded quickly. The tower felt wrong. Not haunted, not supernatural, just wrong. Like a place people had abandoned for good reasons. We left shortly afterward and started the hike back. The return trip should have taken less time. Somehow it didn't. At one point we both became convinced we were heading in the wrong direction. The forest seemed unfamiliar. Landmarks appeared different. More than once I checked the creek just to make sure we were following it correctly. The sun had already begun sinking when we finally approached familiar terrain near the cabin. That's when we heard the voice. Tyler. Both of us froze. The sound came from somewhere among the trees to our left, not far away, maybe 30 yards. Tyler immediately turned toward it. Did you hear that? Yeah. My stomach tightened. Rule 5 surfaced instantly in my memory. Never call each other by name while you're in the woods. Use a radio or a whistle instead. There is something in this forest that likes to mimic human voices. Another call echoed between the trees. Tyler. The voice sounded almost identical to mine. Not perfect, close enough. Tyler slowly looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Then the voice called again, this time from farther away, deeper in the forest. Tyler. I grabbed Tyler's arm before he could move. We're leaving. He nodded immediately. For the first time since arriving, there was no argument. No skepticism. We walked quickly back toward the cabin. Neither of us spoke during the entire hike. Once we reached the porch, both of us seemed to relax slightly. The cabin had become our safe place whether we wanted to admit it or not. Night arrived shortly afterward. Rain returned just after sunset. Wind shook the trees. We ate dinner quietly. The hike had exhausted us. Around 10 o'clock, Tyler suddenly frowned and looked toward the front window. Did the porch light seem dimmer to you? I looked outside. The light appeared normal, maybe slightly weaker than before. Hard to tell. Probably the bulb. Tyler nodded, but he kept glancing toward it throughout the evening. Around midnight, we headed upstairs. This time I left the bedroom door open. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I wanted to hear more of what happened in the cabin. Maybe I simply felt uneasy. Sleep came slowly again. At some point I drifted off. Then a sound woke me. 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. My eyes opened instantly. Darkness filled the room. Beside me, Tyler sat upright. He had heard it too. Neither of us moved. Another set of knocks echoed from downstairs. 3 exactly. Then silence. A voice followed. Calm, patient, calling Tyler's name. The sound drifted through the cabin walls. Not loud, not aggressive, almost friendly. Tyler stared toward the doorway. I could barely see his face in the darkness. Then the voice changed. It started talking. At first I couldn't understand the words. Then I realized it was describing memories. Real memories. Things Tyler and I had talked about while working together. High school stories. Old arguments. Details nobody else should have known. The blood drained from my face. Rule 2 returned immediately. Sometimes it even knows things that only the two of you should know. The voice continued speaking outside the front door. Calmly, casually, like an old friend trying to start a conversation. Neither Tyler nor I responded. Eventually the talking stopped. Silence returned. Then, from somewhere outside, another voice spoke. My voice. Perfect this time. Not almost perfect. Perfect. Called Tyler's name once. Then everything went quiet. Neither of us slept again before sunrise. The next morning felt different. Not because anything obvious had changed, because both of us had finally crossed a line. Up until that night, there had always been room for doubt. Footprints could be explained. Strange lights could be explained. Voices in the woods could be blamed on echoes, wind, or tired minds. But neither Tyler nor I could explain hearing personal conversations repeated by something standing outside our door. We didn't even try. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, while the forest beyond the windows slowly brightened with daylight. Neither of us touched the folded sheet of rules. We didn't need to. By now we both knew them almost by memory. Around noon we radioed Carl again. This time there was no answer. We tried every hour. Nothing. The silence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Even knowing Carl was out there somewhere had helped. Now it felt like the mountains had swallowed him too. The day itself passed quietly, almost suspiciously quietly. Voices. No strange sounds, no fresh footprints. By sunset, I found myself relaxing slightly. That was probably the mistake. Horror never arrived when we expected it. It always waited until normal life felt possible again. After dinner, Tyler suggested checking the storage shed. One of the generators inside had been making an odd, rattling noise earlier that afternoon. We grabbed flashlights and headed outside. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, but enough light remained to see the path clearly. The shed sat roughly 70 yards from the cabin, close enough that we never thought twice about walking there. We entered together. Tyler inspected the generator while I sorted through a stack of fuel containers. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard the cabin door slam shut. The sound echoed through the trees. Both of us looked up immediately. Wind, Tyler said. I wasn't convinced. The air outside had been almost completely still. We stepped out of the shed. The cabin sat where it always had, dark against the fading sky. Nothing moved around it. Then I noticed something. Tyler noticed it at the exact same moment. The porch light had turned on. Neither of us remembered leaving it on. Did you leave that running? Tyler asked. No. We stared at the cabin for several seconds. The front porch looked empty. The windows reflected the last traces of daylight. Nothing seemed unusual, yet neither of us moved. A strange feeling settled over me. The same feeling you get when something is almost wrong but not wrong enough to explain. Finally, Tyler started walking toward the cabin. I followed. Halfway there, he suddenly stopped. Wait, what? He pointed toward the front porch. At first, I couldn't see it. Then I realized what had caught his attention. Somebody was standing near the front door. The figure remained completely motionless, too far away to identify clearly, just a dark silhouette beneath the porch light. My heart immediately started hammering. That's not Carl. Tyler didn't answer. The figure remained perfectly still, neither approaching nor leaving, just standing there, watching the cabin. Watching us. The remaining daylight faded further. Shadows deepened around the property. Suddenly I remembered Rule 1. Always stay together after sunset. During the day you can work separately. But once the sun goes down, do not let the other person out of your sight for more than 5 minutes. Neither of us said the rule out loud. We didn't have to. Tyler slowly backed away from the cabin. I did the same. The figure never moved. Radio, Tyler said quietly. I grabbed the handheld radio from my belt. My hands were shaking slightly. Carl, you there? Static answered, nothing else. We tried again. More static. The figure remained standing beneath the porch light, motionless, silent. Then something happened that made my stomach drop. The figure stepped backward, not turning around, not walking normally. It simply took a slow step backward toward the cabin wall. Then another, then another. Eventually, it disappeared around the side of the building. Neither Tyler nor I waited. We moved quickly toward the porch. Every instinct in my body screamed that this was a terrible idea, but leaving our supplies and radios inside wasn't an option. We reached the front steps. Empty. Footprints. Movement. No sign anybody had been there. Tyler unlocked the door while I scanned the surrounding trees. We entered together and immediately locked everything behind us. For the next hour, we searched every room, every closet, every storage area. Nothing. Nobody had entered the cabin. Nobody had left. The entire encounter felt impossible. Around 10 o'clock, we finally settled into uneasy silence. Then another problem appeared. Tyler couldn't find his radio. We searched the entire downstairs, the kitchen, living room, bedrooms. Nothing. Maybe it's still outside. I looked toward the dark windows. Neither of us wanted to go check. Forget it. Tyler nodded reluctantly. Midnight arrived. Then 1 in the morning. The cabin remained quiet. Too quiet. Around 140 amperes. Tyler headed upstairs while I stayed on the couch. I wasn't tired. My nerves felt stretched too thin. 20 minutes later, I heard something from outside. A whistle. Soft, brief, then silence. My blood immediately ran cold. A few moments later, the whistle came again, from the forest behind the cabin. I stood up slowly. Another whistle answered from farther away, then another, moving through the trees. My eyes shifted toward the rules. Rule 5. Never call each other by name while you're in the woods. Use a radio or a whistle instead. I suddenly realized something. Tyler's missing radio wasn't the only thing gone. His emergency whistle had disappeared too, the same whistle attached to his radio strap. Before I could process that thought, a voice drifted from the darkness beyond the cabin. "Help me." The voice sounded exactly like Tyler. I froze. The sound came from somewhere near the creek. "Help me." My pulse exploded. Tyler was upstairs. I was certain of it. Yet the voice continued. Closer now. "Help me." I rushed toward the stairs. Tyler nearly collided with me halfway down. His face had gone pale. "You hear that?" "Yeah." Another call echoed from outside, perfectly matching Tyler's voice. "Help me." Then came the whistle again. Short, sharp, followed by silence. We stood together listening as something wearing my friend's voice wandered through the forest beyond the cabin. And for the first time since arriving in the mountains, it sounded close enough to reach the porch. The voice continued moving through the forest for nearly 10 minutes. Sometimes it sounded close to the creek. Sometimes it seemed deeper among the trees. Every time it called for help, it sounded exactly like Tyler. Not almost identical, not similar. Perfect. That was the part that bothered me most. Human voices always carried little imperfections. Changes in tone, emotion, breath. This thing sounded like a recording that knew precisely how Tyler spoke. Eventually the calls stopped. The forest fell silent again. Neither of us slept. We sat downstairs until sunrise with every light in the cabin turned on. The moment daylight returned, the fear eased slightly, not completely. Just enough to let us think clearly again. Around 7 in the morning, Tyler stood and stretched. "We're leaving." I looked up from my coffee. "What?" "Today. Carl hired us for 6 weeks." I don't care, I couldn't blame him. Part of me wanted to leave too. But another part remembered the money, the truck repairs, my sister's tuition, the problems waiting back home. Leaving meant walking away from all of that. Tyler seemed to understand exactly what I was thinking. "You know this isn't normal." "I know." "You heard it." "I know." Neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually we agreed to stay one more day. Just long enough to contact Carl in person. If we couldn't find him, we'd leave. That seemed reasonable, at least at the time. Around noon we drove into town. The small mountain community looked exactly as it had during our arrival. The diner, the gas station, the general store. Everything felt strangely ordinary. We found Carl's truck parked behind the diner. Relief washed through me immediately. Finally, we would get answers. That relief disappeared the moment we entered the building. Carl wasn't there. The waitress informed us she hadn't seen him for 3 days. 3 days. Tyler repeated, "You sure?" She nodded. "Carl usually comes in every morning." Neither of us liked that answer. We spent the next hour searching town. No Carl. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knew where he was. Eventually, we returned to the cabin with more questions than before. The drive back felt uncomfortable. Every mile seemed longer than it had during our first week. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered over the mountains again. Wind pushed through the trees. Rain threatened but never arrived. As we unloaded supplies from the truck, Tyler suddenly stopped moving. "Do you smell that?" I paused. The scent reached me a second later. Smoke. Faint. Wood smoke. My eyes immediately moved toward the forest. Thin gray haze drifted between distant trees. "Fire," Tyler said. We grabbed binoculars from the cabin and climbed onto the porch. The smoke wasn't coming from the valley below. It wasn't coming from town either. It rose from somewhere near the direction of the old tower. Neither of us said what we were thinking. Somebody was out there. Or something was. The smoke continued for roughly an hour before disappearing completely. By sunset, the forest looked normal again. The entire incident felt almost dreamlike. Another strange detail added to an already growing pile of strange details. That night, we ate dinner quietly. Around 10 o'clock, Tyler finally unfolded the sheet of rules again. Neither of us had touched it in days. He read through every line slowly, then stopped at Rule 7. If one of you returns to the cabin and the other feels that something is wrong, do not ask why. Do not try to be polite. Ask them this: which way does the eastern creek flow? If they give the wrong answer, lock them outside until sunrise. I'm sorry, but your real friend will always know the answer. Tyler stared at the page for several seconds, then folded it again. That's the one I hate most. Why? because whoever wrote it expected people to doubt each other. I didn't have a response. Deep down, I hated that rule too. Around midnight, we headed upstairs. The weather remained calm. Rain. No wind. Just stillness. For the first time in days, I actually fell asleep. I don't know how long I slept before the sound woke me. A single knock. Not 3. Just 1. My eyes opened immediately. Moonlight filtered through the room. Beside me, Tyler was still asleep. Another knock echoed through the cabin. This one sounded different. Not from the front door. From somewhere downstairs. I sat upright. A third knock followed, then silence. Slowly, I climbed out of bed. The house felt unusually cold. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something strange. The bedroom door at the end of the hall stood open. We never used that room. It had remained closed since our arrival. I stared at it for several seconds. Darkness filled the interior. Nothing moved. Then I heard footsteps downstairs. Soft, slow, deliberate. My pulse immediately accelerated. I rushed back into the room and woke Tyler. Within seconds, we were both standing in the hallway listening. The footsteps continued below us, crossing the living room, then the kitchen, then stopping completely. Neither of us moved. Eventually, Tyler whispered, "Somebody's inside." The words barely left his mouth before we heard the front door close. Not slam. Close. Quietly. Like someone leaving. We waited another full minute before going downstairs. Every room was empty. Every window locked. Every door secured. Nothing appeared disturbed. Yet something had definitely been inside the cabin. We both knew it. Then Tyler noticed something on the kitchen table. A folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped instantly. We approached slowly. The paper looked old, weathered, similar to the rules Carl had given us. Tyler unfolded it first. Neither of us spoke while reading. There were only 6 words written across the center of the page. Carl broke Rule 1. The room suddenly felt much colder. Neither Tyler nor I said anything for several seconds. Outside, somewhere beyond the windows, the forest remained completely silent. And for the first time since arriving in the mountains, I found myself wondering whether Carl was still alive. Neither of us slept after finding the note. We sat in the kitchen until sunrise with the paper lying between us. Every few minutes I found myself reading the same 6 words again. Carl broke Rule 1. The message raised more questions than answers. Who had written it? How had it gotten inside? Why specifically that rule? Most importantly, what had happened to Carl? By morning, both of us looked exhausted. Tyler eventually folded the note and slid it into his pocket. "We're leaving tomorrow," I nodded. This time there was no argument. Whatever money remained on the contract no longer mattered. Something was happening in those mountains. Something that had already affected Carl. We spent most of the day preparing, fueling the truck, packing supplies, checking weather forecasts. The plan was simple. Leave at sunrise. Drive back to Colorado Springs. Forget the cabin ever existed. At least that was the plan. Around noon, we heard a vehicle approaching. Both of us rushed toward the front window. Relief immediately hit me. Carl's truck. It rolled slowly into the clearing and stopped beside the cabin. For the first time in days, I felt genuine hope. Tyler was already moving toward the door. Then he froze. Carl remained seated behind the wheel, motionless. Several seconds passed. He still didn't move. My stomach tightened. Something felt wrong immediately. Tyler noticed it too. We stepped onto the porch together. Carl finally opened the driver's door and climbed out. The movement looked normal at first. Then I noticed how stiff it seemed. Every motion appeared slightly delayed, like someone copying human behavior after watching it from a distance. Carl slowly turned toward us. He smiled. The expression never reached his eyes. "Morning." His voice sounded correct, yet somehow empty. Tyler looked at me briefly before answering. "You've been gone a while." Carl nodded. "Truck trouble." Silence followed. Nobody believed that explanation. Carl started walking toward the porch. Each step felt strangely deliberate. My pulse accelerated. Then I remembered Rule 7. If one of you returns to the cabin and the other feels that something is wrong, do not ask why. Do not try to be polite. Ask them this: which way does the Eastern Creek flow? I realized Tyler was thinking the exact same thing. We exchanged a quick glance. Carl reached the bottom step. Tyler spoke first. "Which way does the Eastern Creek flow?" The smile disappeared instantly. Carl stopped moving. The change happened so quickly it felt unnatural. For several seconds he simply stood there staring at us. Then he answered, "West." The world seemed to freeze. The creek flowed east. We both knew that. We had followed it for miles. Tyler stepped backward immediately. So did I. Carl remained standing near the porch, expressionless, watching us. Then he smiled again, slowly, deliberately. My entire body went cold. Tyler slammed the front door shut. I locked it. Every lock, every bolt, every latch. Outside, silence settled over the clearing. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Tyler whispered, "That wasn't him." I didn't argue. Deep down, I knew exactly what he meant. We looked through the window. Carl still stood outside, motionless beneath the afternoon sun. Hours passed. He never left. Sometimes he stood beside the truck, sometimes near the porch, occasionally near the tree line. But he never disappeared completely. Every time we checked, he was still there, waiting. As evening approached, clouds rolled across the mountains once again. Wind moved through the trees. The atmosphere around the cabin felt heavier than ever before. Shortly after sunset, Carl finally vanished. One moment he stood near the truck. The next moment he was gone. Neither of us saw him leave. The disappearance somehow felt worse than his presence. Darkness settled quickly afterward. We moved furniture against the doors, checked every window, loaded emergency supplies into backpacks. Around 10 o'clock, we heard the first whistle. It came from the woods beyond the creek. Then another answered from farther away. Then another. Soon whistles echoed from every direction. Some sounded close, others distant. Tyler looked toward me. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The forest sounded crowded. Around 11, the whistles stopped. Complete silence followed. Then came the voices. At first only one, then several, calling our names from different directions. Some sounded like family members. Some sounded like coworkers. One sounded exactly like my younger sister. I felt physically sick hearing it. The voices never shouted. They spoke calmly, patiently, like people trying to get our attention. Eventually, one of them began knocking 3 times. Then another 3. Then another. Different locations, different windows, different walls. Always 3 knocks. Midnight arrived. Then 1 in the morning. The cabin shook occasionally as wind moved through the mountains. The voices continued, sometimes near, sometimes far away. Then suddenly everything stopped. Every sound vanished at once. The silence felt unnatural, heavy, oppressive. Tyler slowly stood from the couch. Something's changed. Before I could answer, a sound echoed across the roof. 1 footstep, then another, then another. We immediately started counting. 5, 10, 15, 20. The footsteps continued. 25, 30, 35, 40. The roof seemed too small for the distance being covered. Yet the steps never stopped. They circled endlessly above us, back and forth, back and forth. More than once it sounded like multiple sets of footsteps moving together. Eventually they stopped directly overhead. Silence returned. Then something scratched across the ceiling. Long, slow, deliberate. The sound moved above the living room, then the kitchen, then the hallway. Listening to it felt like waiting for a predator outside a locked door. Around 2 o'clock, the scratching finally stopped. Neither of us moved. Neither of us slept. Then, at exactly 2:17 amperes, the porch light went out, the same time as before. My blood instantly ran cold. Tyler looked toward the clock, then toward me. Neither of us needed to say anything. We already knew what came next. Outside the cabin, somewhere in the darkness beyond the windows, a man began screaming for help. The scream echoed through the forest with the same raw desperation we had heard before. A man's voice, panicked, exhausted, begging for help somewhere beyond the trees. Every instinct in my body wanted to move toward the door. Human beings are wired that way. When someone sounds terrified, you help them. That instinct was exactly what made Rule 6 so disturbing. It understood how people think. Beside me, Tyler sat rigid on the couch. Neither of us spoke. The screaming continued, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. Then came crashing branches, heavy footsteps, the sound of somebody running through the darkness toward the cabin. My pulse hammered inside my ears. The screams grew louder, closer, closer. Then they stopped abruptly. Silence flooded the clearing once again. I looked toward the window. Nothing, only darkness beyond the glass. Several minutes passed. Neither of us moved. Eventually, the porch light flickered once and turned back on. The forest sound slowly returned. Wind moved through the trees. Water flowed through the creek. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Dawn felt impossibly far away. Around 4 a.m, exhaustion finally overcame fear. I drifted into a shallow sleep on the couch. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight filled the room. Tyler was already awake, standing beside the front window, staring outside. "What?" I asked. He pointed toward the driveway. My stomach immediately dropped. Carl's truck sat exactly where it had been parked the previous afternoon. Neither of us had gone near it since. Yet now the driver's door stood open. We exchanged a look, then headed outside together. The morning air felt cold and damp. Every shadow beneath the trees seemed deeper than usual. We approached the truck cautiously. The interior was empty. No keys, no paperwork, no sign of Carl. Then Tyler noticed something on the passenger seat. Another folded note. My chest tightened immediately. He picked it up and unfolded it. There was only one sentence written inside. "Leave before sunset." That was all. No signature. No explanation. Nothing else. We stared at the message for several seconds. Then Tyler folded it and shoved it into his pocket. "We're leaving now." For once, I didn't hesitate. Within an hour, we had packed everything. Clothes, tools, supplies, food, whatever could fit into the truck. The entire time I kept expecting something to happen. A voice, a knock, footsteps. Instead, the forest remained completely silent. By early afternoon, we were ready. Tyler climbed into the passenger seat while I started the engine. Relief washed through me. We had made it. We had followed the rules. We had survived long enough to leave. Then the truck died. The engine sputtered twice and shut off. I stared at the dashboard. No, I tried again. The starter clicked uselessly. Nothing happened. Tyler climbed out immediately. We checked the battery, fuel, connections. Everything appeared normal, yet the truck refused to start. Hours passed. We worked continuously. Nothing helped. The sun slowly moved lower in the sky. Shadows lengthened across the clearing. Anxiety grew heavier with every passing minute. Around 5 o'clock, Tyler slammed the hood shut. "Forget it." "What?" "We take Carl's truck." It was the only option. We transferred our supplies, loaded everything into the second vehicle. This time, neither of us relaxed until the engine started. The moment it roared to life, I felt something close to hope. We pulled away from the cabin. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. The building slowly disappeared behind the trees. Neither of us looked back. For nearly 20 minutes, the drive felt normal. Then we reached the first fork in the road and stopped. Both directions looked unfamiliar. I frowned. This isn't right. Tyler stared through the windshield. We've driven this road before, I know. Yet somehow neither path looked familiar. We chose the left fork. 20 minutes later, we arrived back at the cabin. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at the building, the same porch, the same trees, the same clearing. Somehow we had returned to the exact place we had left. Tyler climbed out immediately. No. We tried again. Different road, different direction, different turns. An hour later, we returned to the cabin once more. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains. Panic finally began creeping into my thoughts. Something was wrong with the roads, or with us, or with the mountains themselves. Night arrived before we could escape. The moment darkness settled across the forest, both of us knew we had lost. We carried our supplies back inside. Neither of us spoke during dinner. Neither of us touched the television. The cabin felt different now, less like shelter, more like a trap. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 slow strikes against the front door. Neither of us reacted. Then another 3. Then silence. A voice followed shortly afterward. Calm. Familiar. It sounded exactly like Carl. "Open the door." Tyler stared at the floor. The voice came again. "You need to leave." Neither of us answered. Eventually, the voice faded away. Hours later, I found myself standing near the kitchen window. The clock read 2:11 amperes. Outside, moonlight covered the clearing. That's when I saw him. A man standing near the tree line, motionless, watching the cabin. Even from that distance, I recognized him. Carl, or something wearing Carl's appearance. He remained there for several seconds, then slowly raised one arm, pointing toward the forest behind him. I immediately remembered Rule 3, the man standing in the woods, the one you were never supposed to watch. My stomach turned cold. I stepped away from the window and closed the curtains. Dawn finally arrived several hours later. Then something unexpected happened. The truck started perfectly. No problems. No hesitation. As if nothing had ever been wrong. Neither Tyler nor I wasted a second. We loaded our supplies and left immediately. This time the roads behaved normally. Every turn looked familiar. Every landmark appeared where it should. By midday we reached town. By evening we were heading back toward Colorado Springs. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. We simply wanted distance between ourselves and those mountains. Weeks passed afterward, then months. Tyler quit the HVAC company and moved to another state. I stayed in Colorado. Life slowly returned to normal, or close enough. Sometimes we still talked on the phone. Neither of us liked discussing the cabin. Some experiences never fit comfortably into conversation. Last winter, nearly a year after everything happened, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was a single photograph, the cabin. Taken at night. Snow covered the roof. The porch light glowed against the darkness. At first I thought somebody was playing a prank. Then I noticed two figures standing near the front door. One was clearly Tyler. The other was me. We were both facing the camera, standing side by side beneath the porch light. The problem was that neither of us had ever taken a photograph there. And in the picture behind us, standing motionless among the trees, was a third figure, watching, waiting. Even now, I keep that photograph locked inside a drawer. Sometimes I tell myself it was edited. Sometimes I convince myself there must be a logical explanation. Most days that works. Most days. But every once in a while, usually late at night, I take the photograph out and look at it again. And every single time, the figure in the trees seems a little closer to the cabin than it was before.